Have you ever judged someone based on their appearance and been so utterly, completely, devastatingly wrong that it changed your entire perspective on life? I have, and what happened that day still haunts me in the most profound way possible. My name doesn't matter, but my story does because it could happen to anyone, and maybe, just maybe, it's already happened to you without you even realizing it. I worked at one of the most prestigious private banks in Manhattan, the kind of place where the marble floors gleamed so brightly you could see your reflection, where crystal chandeliers worth more than most people's homes hung from ceilings that seemed to touch the sky, and where every client who walked through our doors wore watches that cost more than luxury cars. I had worked my way up to senior wealth management advisor, a position I wore like a badge of honor, a symbol of everything I had achieved in my 38 years of life. I came from money, I won't lie about that, but I had also worked hard. Or so I told myself every morning when I looked in the mirror of my penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. My suits were custom-tailored on Savile Row, my shoes were handcrafted Italian leather, and my tie clips were vintage pieces I collected from exclusive auctions. I lived and breathed success, and I had become exactly what I always wanted to be: important, respected, wealthy, and admired. But there was something else I had become, something I didn't see clearly until that autumn afternoon, when a boy no older than 16 walked through our polished brass doors and shattered every assumption I had ever made about worth, value, and what truly matters in this world. It was a Tuesday. I remember that clearly because Tuesdays were always our slowest days. The calm before the midweek rush when our ultra-wealthy clients would sweep in with their latest investment opportunities and financial concerns. The morning had been uneventful, filled with the usual consultations about offshore accounts, estate planning, and portfolio diversification. I had just finished a meeting with a tech billionaire who wanted to discuss moving $50 million into emerging markets, and I was feeling particularly satisfied with myself, riding that high that comes from handling obscene amounts of money as if it were as simple as choosing what to have for lunch. The autumn sunlight streamed through our floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden shadows across the banking hall, and everything felt right in my world, perfectly ordered, and exactly as it should be. I was standing near the main desk, chatting with Margaret, our head teller who had been with the bank for 23 years and had seen everything, or so we thought. We were discussing weekend plans, something trivial about a charity gala I was obligated to attend, when the atmosphere in the room shifted. It's strange how you can feel a change in energy before you even understand what's causing it, like the air pressure drops before a storm or the temperature falls before snow begins to fall. I turned toward the entrance, and that's when I saw him, the boy who would change everything I thought I knew about the world. He couldn't have been more than 16, maybe 17 at the oldest, with a thin frame that suggested he hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, maybe weeks. His clothes were the first thing everyone noticed, because they were so starkly out of place in our sanctuary of wealth and privilege. He wore jeans that were ripped not by designer intention but by genuine wear and tear, the kind of damage that comes from use and time and necessity. His sneakers were scuffed and dirty, with soles that were separating from the fabric, held together with what looked like duct tape wrapped around the base. His jacket was too big for him, probably donated or found at a thrift store, a faded navy blue windbreaker with a broken zipper and stains that no amount of washing could remove. His hair was unkempt, not artfully messy like some fashion statement, but genuinely unwashed and tangled, falling into his eyes in greasy strands that he kept pushing back with nervous fingers. His face was smudged with dirt, and his hands, I noticed immediately, were rough and calloused, the hands of someone who worked with them, who knew physical labor in a way that I never had and never would. But it was his eyes that I remember most vividly, even now, years later. They were dark brown, almost black in certain lights, and they held something that I couldn't quite identify in that moment. Something that looked like determination mixed with sadness, knowledge mixed with pain, wisdom far beyond his years mixed with a vulnerability that made him seem even younger than he was. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Clients who had been discussing million-dollar transactions turned to stare. Margaret's hand moved instinctively toward the silent alarm button beneath her counter, a precaution we had been trained to take whenever someone who didn't fit our typical client profile entered the bank. Security guards, usually relaxed and almost invisible in their stations, straightened up and moved slightly closer, their hands hovering near their belts where their radios and other equipment hung. I felt it too, that immediate judgment, That instant categorization that happens in the primitive part of our brains before our rational minds can even process what we're seeing. Threat, my mind whispered. Problem. Homeless kid who probably wandered in from the street looking for a bathroom or maybe planning something worse. I'm ashamed to admit it now. Deeply and profoundly ashamed. But in that moment, I assumed the worst. We all did. It's so easy to judge, so reflexive and automatic, so deeply ingrained in us by society and culture and our own experiences and prejudices. We look at someone and within seconds, sometimes milliseconds, we create an entire story about who they are, where they come from, what they want, whether they belong. And this boy, standing in the entrance of our prestigious bank with his dirty clothes and unkempt appearance, did not belong, or so every single person in that building believed with absolute certainty. I watched as he took a few hesitant steps forward, his eyes scanning the vast banking hall with what I interpreted as nervousness, maybe even guilt. He's looking for an escape route, I thought. He's planning something. I moved closer to Margaret, ready to intervene, ready to protect our bank and our clients from whatever this intruder had in mind. The boy approached the main desk slowly, and I could see him swallowing hard, gathering courage for whatever he was about to say. Margaret's face had gone rigid, her professional smile nowhere to be seen, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that broadcasted her discomfort and suspicion. Other staff members had noticed now, and I could feel them watching, waiting, ready to act if necessary. Mrs. Pemberton, one of our oldest and wealthiest clients, actually clutched her Hermes purse closer to her body and took a step back, as if poverty itself might be contagious, as if this boy's misfortune might somehow transfer to her through proximity. The boy reached the desk and stood there for a moment, and the silence in that enormous room was deafening, oppressive, heavy with judgment and assumption and fear. I was close enough to see that his hands were trembling slightly, that his breathing was shallow and quick, that despite his determination he was terrified. Good, part of me thought cruelly. Maybe he'll realize he doesn't belong here and leave on his own. But he didn't leave. Instead, he opened his mouth and spoke, and his voice when it came was quiet but steady, with an accent that suggested he had learned English as a second language, each word carefully pronounced and deliberate. He said something that none of us expected, something so preposterous and absurd given his appearance that several people actually laughed, quick, nervous laughs that they tried to stifle, but couldn't quite contain. He said he needed to access a safety deposit vault, one of our most secure and exclusive services, reserved only for our highest-tier clients, people with net worths in the hundreds of millions, sometimes billions. The vault access required multiple forms of identification, biometric verification, and authorization codes that were changed monthly and known only to the client and the vault manager. It was impossible. This boy, this dirty, poor-looking teenager standing in our bank with his broken shoes and stained jacket, couldn't possibly have legitimate access to one of our vaults. It had to be a scam, a con, maybe something he had seen in a movie and thought he could pull off. I stepped forward then, my professional instincts kicking in, ready to handle this situation with the firm but polite authority I had perfected over years of dealing with difficult situations. I was about to ask him to leave, to explain that he clearly had the wrong place, when Margaret, to her credit, decided to follow protocol exactly as we had been trained. She asked for his identification and account information, her voice cold and skeptical, making it clear through her tone that she was simply going through the motions before calling security to escort him out. The boy reached into his jacket pocket and I saw two security guards tense immediately, hands moving toward their equipment, ready to act if he pulled out anything threatening. But what he withdrew was just a wallet, or what passed for a wallet, really just a Ziploc plastic bag with some papers and cards inside, protected from the elements in the only way he could afford. He placed several items on the marble counter with careful, deliberate movements, as if he had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, and knew exactly what was required. There was an identification card, worn and bent at the corners, but still valid. There was a piece of paper with numbers written on it in neat, careful handwriting. And there was something else, a small metal key attached to a chain that looked like it had once been silver, but was now tarnished and dull. Margaret picked up the identification with 2 fingers as if she didn't want to touch it more than necessary, and examined it with obvious skepticism. I leaned in to look over her shoulder, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The name on the ID was Roberto Castellanos, age 16, with an address in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the Bronx, a place I had only ever read about in crime statistics and poverty reports. But it was the next piece of information that made Margaret pause, that made her eyes widen slightly, that made her look up at me with confusion and disbelief written across her features. The boy, Roberto, provided an account number, and when Margaret entered it into our system with trembling fingers, the screen lit up with information that seemed to contradict everything we could see with our own eyes. The account was flagged as ultra-high priority, the kind of designation reserved for our most important clients, the kind that meant whatever this person wanted, they got. No questions asked, no delays permitted. I leaned closer to the screen, certain there had to be a mistake, some error in the system because this couldn't be possible. But there it was, in black and white digital text, undeniable and real. Margaret looked at me with wide eyes that asked 1,000 questions I couldn't answer. Protocol demanded that we verify the biometric information before granting vault access, so she asked Roberto to place his hand on the scanner, a sleek piece of technology that read palm prints and matched them against our database. I expected the system to reject him, to flash red and sound an alarm, to confirm what we all believed we knew about this situation. But when his dirty, calloused hand pressed against the glass, the scanner glowed green, and a soft beep confirmed a positive match. Authorized, the screen read. Access granted. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. This couldn't be happening. How could this poor kid, this boy who looked like he had been sleeping on the streets, have legitimate access to one of our most secure vaults? My mind raced through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Stolen information? Identity theft? Some elaborate scheme we hadn't encountered before? But the biometric scan didn't lie. That was his hand, his palm print, registered in our system and verified by technology that was supposed to be foolproof. Margaret looked at me again, and this time her expression asked a direct question. What do we do? I should have trusted the system. I should have accepted what the verification was telling us, but my prejudices were too strong, my assumptions too deeply rooted. I couldn't reconcile what I was seeing with what I believed I knew about the world. So I did something I had never done before in my entire career at the bank. I demanded additional verification. I called for our vault manager, Mr. Harrison, a man who had been with the bank for 40 years and who knew every high-profile client we had ever served. If anyone could sort out this confusion, it was him. While we waited for Mr. Harrison to arrive from his office on the 3rd floor, an uncomfortable silence settled over the banking hall. Roberto stood at the counter, patient and quiet, his hands now clasped in front of him, his eyes downcast as if he could feel every judgmental stare boring into his back. And there were many stares. Our clients and staff had formed a loose semicircle around the main desk, everyone pretending to be busy with their own affairs, but obviously watching this drama unfold with fascination and suspicion. I heard whispered conversations, speculation about who this boy was and what he was trying to pull off. Mrs. Pemberton loudly declared to her companion that the bank's security standards had clearly declined if they were allowing just anyone to walk in off the street. Mr. Chin, a real estate mogul who owned half of Lower Manhattan, suggested that this was probably some kind of viral video stunt, that hidden cameras were capturing everything for social media entertainment. No one, and I mean absolutely no one, considered the possibility that this boy might be exactly who the system said he was, that he might have every right to be here, that we might be the ones in the wrong. I stood there, arms crossed, watching Roberto with a mixture of suspicion and something else I couldn't quite name, something that felt uncomfortably like shame trying to push its way through my certainty. The boy never once looked angry or offended by our treatment of him. He simply waited with a patience that suggested he had experienced this kind of judgment before, many times, and had learned to endure it with quiet dignity. Mr. Harrison arrived, his usual composed expression flickering with confusion when he saw the situation before him. Margaret quickly explained in hushed tones, showing him the verification results, the account information, the biometric confirmation. I watched Mr. Harrison's face transform from skepticism to shock, to something I had never seen in him before, recognition. His eyes moved from the computer screen to Roberto's face, studying the boy with new intensity. And then, impossibly, his stern features softened into something approaching respect. Mr. Harrison straightened his tie, cleared his throat and did something that made everyone in the banking hall gasp audibly. He extended his hand to Roberto and said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mr. Castellanos, welcome back to our bank. I apologize for any inconvenience. If you'll follow me, I'll personally escort you to your vault." The shock was electric. People actually gasped out loud. Mrs. Pemberton's mouth fell open in a way that would have been comical in any other situation. Margaret's hands froze above her keyboard. And I, standing there in my $1,000 suit with my carefully cultivated image of success and importance, felt something crack inside my chest. Some certainty I had held about the world and how it worked, about who mattered and who didn't, about what wealth looked like and how worth was measured. Mr. Harrison gestured toward the elevator that led to our vault level, and Roberto followed him with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout this entire ordeal. As they walked away, I found myself following, unable to resist, needing to understand what was happening, needing to see this through to whatever impossible conclusion awaited us in the vault below. The elevator descended in silence, the three of us standing in that small, elegant space lined with mirrors that reflected our images back at us in infinite regression. I stared at those reflections, seeing myself next to this boy, the contrast so stark, it was almost painful. My perfectly styled hair next to his unwashed tangles, my manicured hands next to his calloused fingers, my expression of confused disbelief next to his calm acceptance. Who was I really seeing in that mirror? Who was the person I had become? So quick to judge, so certain of my superiority, so blind to anything beyond the superficial markers of wealth and status. The elevator stopped with a gentle chime, and the doors opened onto our vault level, a temperature-controlled space with walls lined with safety deposit boxes of various sizes, each one containing treasures and secrets belonging to people with more money than most could imagine. Mr. Harrison led us to one of the largest vaults, box number 747, a premium unit that cost $50,000 per year just to maintain. He inserted his master key, then waited for Roberto to insert his key. The boy did so with steady hands, no longer trembling, as if now that he had been recognized and acknowledged, some of his nervousness had dissipated. The dual locks clicked open simultaneously, and Mr. Harrison pulled out the long metal box and placed it on the private viewing table in the center of the room. He stepped back, giving Roberto privacy, but I remained close, unable to look away, my heart pounding with anticipation and something else, something that felt like dread mixed with hope, though I couldn't have explained why I felt either emotion. Roberto stood before the box for a long moment, his hand resting on the cool metal surface, and I could see his chest rising and falling with deep breaths, as if he was gathering courage for what came next. Then, slowly, carefully, he opened the lid, and what I saw inside made my entire worldview crumble into dust. The box was filled with documents, photographs, and several items that told a story I never could have imagined. There were property deeds, dozens of them, for buildings throughout New York City. There were stock certificates from major corporations, representing holdings worth hundreds of millions of dollars. There were legal documents establishing trusts and foundations. And there were photographs, old faded pictures that showed a wealthy family, elegant and refined, standing in front of mansions and expensive cars, living lives of extraordinary privilege. In several of the photos I could see a younger version of Roberto, maybe 7 or 8 years old, dressed in expensive clothes, smiling at the camera with the careless joy of a child who had never known want or struggle. But there were other photos too, more recent ones showing the gradual decline of this family's fortune, the slow descent into poverty that had transformed that carefree boy into the teenager standing before me now. I picked up one document with shaking hands, a legal brief that explained in cold clinical language how Roberto's father had died 3 years ago, leaving behind a complex estate that had been tied up in probate and legal disputes. How Roberto's mother had fallen ill shortly after, unable to navigate the legal system or protect their assets. How lawyers and distant relatives and supposed friends had stripped away most of their wealth, leaving only what had been secured in this vault, protected by trusts that couldn't be touched until Roberto turned 18. The story unfolded before my eyes in papers and photographs and legal documents that formed a narrative of tragedy and survival and quiet determination that shamed every assumption I had made. Roberto had been living on the streets for the past 6 months, working odd jobs to survive, sleeping in shelters when he could find space, enduring hunger and cold and danger because he had no other choice, because the system had failed him, because adults who should have protected him had instead exploited him. But he hadn't given up. Despite everything, he had held on to the key to this vault, protected it like the precious thing it was, knowing that inside was his future, his family's legacy, the proof of who he had been and who he could be again. He came to the bank regularly, Mr. Harrison later told me, every few months to check on the contents to ensure everything was still there, to remind himself that his current circumstances were temporary, that he had a future waiting for him if he could just survive long enough to reach his 18th birthday, just 15 months away. And we, the staff of this prestigious bank, the guardians of wealth and privilege, had looked at this boy and seen only what was on the surface. We had judged him based on his clothes, his appearance, the dirt on his face, and the holes in his shoes. We had assumed the worst because we couldn't imagine that poverty and wealth could exist in the same person, that someone who looked like him could have any legitimate claim to the world we inhabited. Have you ever been so wrong about something that it fundamentally changed who you are? I want you to think about that question. Really think about it, because what happened next changed me in ways I'm still discovering years later. Comment below if you've ever misjudged someone and later realized your mistake, because I promise you we've all done it, and we need to talk about it. We need to acknowledge it. We need to do better. I stood there in that vault, surrounded by the evidence of my prejudice and ignorance, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my entire life. Roberto carefully removed several documents from the box, papers he needed for whatever legal matters he was handling, and I watched him organize them with meticulous care, each movement deliberate and practiced. Mr. Harrison had left us alone, perhaps sensing that I needed this moment, this uncomfortable confrontation with my own failures. When Roberto finished and closed the box, preparing to return it to its secure location, I finally found my voice. I apologized, the words catching in my throat because they felt so inadequate, so pathetically insufficient for the judgment I had passed and the treatment he had endured. I told him I was sorry for doubting him, for the suspicion, for the assumption that he didn't belong. And do you know what he did? This boy who had every right to be angry, to lash out, to make me feel even worse than I already felt? He looked at me with those dark eyes that had seen far too much pain for someone his age, and he said with a small, sad smile that broke my heart, that he was used to it. Used to it. Those 3 words hit me harder than any angry accusation could have. He was used to being judged, used to being dismissed, used to being treated as less than human because of how he looked and where he had fallen in life's cruel lottery. How many other Robertos were out there, I wondered? People with dignity and worth and stories that we never bothered to learn because we were too busy making assumptions based on appearance. How many times had I passed someone on the street and made instant judgments about their value, their character, their right to exist in my space? How many opportunities had I missed to see the humanity in someone because I was too focused on the superficial markers that told me whether they belonged in my world? We rode the elevator back up to the main floor in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, heavy with unspoken truths and uncomfortable realizations. When we emerged back into the banking hall, I noticed that the crowd had not dispersed. If anything, more people had gathered, curious about the outcome, eager for their assumptions to be confirmed so they could feel justified in their prejudices. But what they saw confused them. They saw Mr. Harrison treating Roberto with the same respect he showed to our billionaire clients. They saw me walking beside this boy with a new expression on my face, something that probably looked like shame and revelation mixed together. They saw Roberto holding legal documents and moving toward the exit with his head held high, no longer the uncertain intruder, but someone who had every right to be there, who had more right than most of us to claim dignity and respect. Mrs. Pemberton actually approached Mr. Harrison and demanded to know what was going on, why we were allowing such a person to access our vaults. And Mr. Harrison, bless him, looked at her with cold professionalism and said that Mr. Castellanos was one of our valued clients and that his affairs were confidential, just like hers, and that perhaps she should consider that appearances can be deeply deceiving. The scandal of it rippled through our client base for weeks afterward. Some clients actually transferred their accounts to other banks, offended that we would serve someone who looked like Roberto. But others, the ones with more wisdom and less prejudice, stayed, and some even asked Mr. Harrison how they could help the boy, whether there were legal funds or assistance programs that could help him navigate his situation until he came of age. That's when I learned that Roberto had been too proud to ask for help, too determined to survive on his own terms, too afraid that accepting charity would somehow diminish his claim to his family's legacy. I couldn't get Roberto out of my mind in the days and weeks that followed. His face haunted my dreams. His dignity in the face of our judgment weighed on my conscience like a physical burden. I had built my entire identity on being successful, on being important, on being part of an elite world that separated itself from those deemed less worthy. But what was that worth if it came at the cost of my humanity, my ability to see people as they truly were rather than as I assumed they must be? I started noticing things I had ignored before. The homeless man who sat outside our bank every morning, whom I had walked past for 3 years without ever meeting his eyes or acknowledging his existence. The cleaning staff who worked in our building at night, invisible laborers whose stories I had never considered. The delivery people and service workers and all the people who made my comfortable life possible, but whom I had relegated to the background of my awareness, extras in the movie where I was the star. I began to understand that I had been living in a bubble of privilege so thick and impenetrable that I had lost touch with the reality most people experienced, that I had constructed a worldview where worth was measured in dollars and status, where humanity was conditional on meeting certain superficial criteria, where people like Roberto were anomalies to be explained away, rather than individuals to be respected. I made a decision then, sitting in my penthouse apartment one evening, looking out at the glittering lights of Manhattan that represented so much wealth and so much inequality existing side by side. I decided that I needed to do something, not just for Roberto, but for myself, to salvage whatever remained of my humanity before it was too late, before I became so calcified in my prejudices that I could no longer recognize myself in the mirror. I used my connections, called in favors from lawyers and judges and social workers I knew, through my work with wealthy clients. I learned that Roberto's legal situation was complicated but not hopeless, that with proper representation and advocacy, much of his family's estate could be preserved and accessed sooner than his 18th birthday. I found a pro bono legal firm willing to take his case, convinced them that this was exactly the kind of situation they existed to address. I arranged for temporary housing through a nonprofit I had donated to in the past but never really paid attention to, thinking my money was enough, never considering that my time and energy and actual involvement might matter more. I did these things quietly without fanfare, because this wasn't about making myself feel better or earning some kind of redemption points. This was about recognizing that I had been wrong, fundamentally and completely wrong about so many things, and that maybe, just maybe, I could use my privilege and resources to actually help someone rather than just accumulating more wealth for myself. Roberto was hesitant at first, suspicious of my motives, and I couldn't blame him. Why should he trust me after how I had treated him? But slowly, carefully, I explained that I wasn't looking for gratitude or recognition. I told him the truth, that meeting him had shown me what I had become and that helping him was really about saving myself from turning into someone I no longer wanted to be. He listened with that same patient dignity he had shown in the bank, and eventually, cautiously, he accepted the help. Over the following months, I watched Roberto's situation gradually improve. The legal team made progress on his case. He moved into stable housing. He enrolled in school again, something he had dropped out of when his mother died and he had nowhere to live. And slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice it happening, we became something like friends, though the relationship was complex and fraught with the history of our first meeting. Roberto taught me things my expensive education had never covered. He taught me about resilience, about maintaining dignity in the face of circumstances that would break most people. He taught me about the invisible structures of privilege that I had benefited from my entire life, without ever acknowledging or appreciating. He taught me about the judgments that poor people face every single day, the constant suspicion, the assumption that poverty is a moral failing rather than a circumstance, the exhausting work of having to prove your humanity over and over again to people who have already decided you don't matter. And in teaching me these things, he gave me a gift far more valuable than anything in his family's vault. He gave me perspective, awareness, the ability to see beyond the surface of things, to the deeper truths that exist underneath. I started volunteering at homeless shelters and food banks, not as some wealthy benefactor dropping in to feel good about himself, but as someone actually trying to understand the systems that create and perpetuate poverty. I changed how I interacted with clients at the bank, started seeing them as human beings with stories rather than just account numbers and asset portfolios. I examined my own spending habits, my consumption patterns, the ways I used money to insulate myself from reality and signal my status to others. I didn't become perfect overnight, didn't suddenly transform into some enlightened being free of prejudice and assumption, but I became more aware, more questioning of my own reflexive judgments, more willing to admit when I was wrong and learn from my mistakes. The day Roberto turned 18 was remarkable for many reasons. The legal battles had been resolved in his favor, and his family's estate, while diminished from what it had once been, was still substantial enough to give him security and opportunity. He could have used that money to erase all evidence of the poverty he had experienced, to pretend those months of struggle had never happened, to reconstruct the privileged life he had known as a child. But that's not what he did. Instead, he used a significant portion of his inheritance to establish a foundation dedicated to helping young people, in situations similar to what he had experienced, kids who had fallen through the cracks of the system, who had assets or prospects or potential, but no one to help them navigate the complex legal and social structures that determined their fates. He hired lawyers to provide free representation to minors dealing with probate issues. He funded emergency housing for homeless teenagers. He created scholarship programs for kids who had been forced to drop out of school due to circumstances beyond their control. And he did all of this with the same quiet dignity he had shown that day in the bank, without seeking recognition or praise, simply doing what he believed was right because he knew firsthand how desperate the need was. I was there at the foundation's opening, standing in the back of the room as Roberto gave a speech about his journey and his vision for helping others. I watched him, this young man who had every reason to be bitter and angry, and focused solely on reclaiming what he had lost, instead choosing to use his resources and his painful experiences to make a difference for others. And I thought about how close I had come to never knowing his story, to remaining trapped in my bubble of privilege and prejudice, to missing out on one of the most important lessons of my life, because I had been too quick to judge based on appearance. Years have passed since that autumn afternoon when a poor-looking boy entered our prestigious bank, and we all assumed the worst until the vault opened and revealed the truth. I'm not the same person I was then, and I'm grateful for that transformation, painful as it was to achieve. I left the private bank eventually, found it impossible to continue working in an environment that reinforced the very prejudices I was trying to overcome. I now work for Roberto's Foundation, using my financial expertise to help young people navigate the complex systems that had nearly destroyed him. I make far less money than I did before, drive a used car instead of a luxury vehicle, live in a modest apartment instead of a penthouse, and I'm happier than I ever was in my old life, more fulfilled, more connected to something meaningful beyond my own comfort and status. Roberto and I remain close, bonded by that transformative encounter and the journey we've both taken since then. He sometimes jokes that he should thank me for judging him that day, because my obvious prejudice made him more determined than ever to succeed and prove that worth isn't determined by appearance or circumstances. But I'm the one who should be thanking him, and I do often, for showing me what I had become and giving me the chance to become something better. The most important lesson I learned, the one I want you to take away from this story, is that every single person you encounter has a story you don't know, a struggle you haven't seen, a dignity that exists independent of their circumstances. That poor-looking boy who walks into your life might be carrying a vault full of worth that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with character, resilience, and humanity. That person you're about to judge based on their clothes or appearance or circumstances might be the one who teaches you the most important lesson of your life if you're willing to look beyond the surface and see them as they truly are. So I want you to do something for me right now. Think about someone you've judged recently based on their appearance. It might have been someone you passed on the street, someone who came into your workplace, someone you encountered at a store or restaurant. Think about what assumptions you made about them, what story you created in your mind about who they were and whether they mattered. And then ask yourself, what if you were wrong? What if that person had a story as complex and meaningful as Roberto's? What if your judgment prevented you from seeing their humanity, from learning something important, from making a connection that could change both of your lives? I know this story has been long and I appreciate you staying with me through all of it, but these lessons, these truths, they require time and attention to fully understand. They can't be reduced to quick sound bites or simple conclusions. The transformation of prejudice into awareness, of assumption into understanding, of judgment into compassion, these are complex processes that take time and effort, and a willingness to be uncomfortable with what we discover about ourselves. I've shared my story, my shame, my failure, and my redemption, not because I think I'm special, or because I want praise for eventually doing the right thing. I've shared it because I believe we all need to confront these issues in ourselves. All need to examine the ways we judge and dismiss and dehumanize others, based on superficial characteristics that tell us nothing about who they really are. Comment below, and tell me about a time when you misjudged someone, when your assumptions were proven wrong, when you learned to see beyond the surface. Share your own stories of transformation and awakening, because these conversations are how we grow, how we challenge each other to be better, how we create a world where Roberto's story is impossible because everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think or feel or question your own assumptions and prejudices, then please hit that like button, because it helps other people find this story and maybe learn the same lessons I did. Subscribe to Through My Eyes for more stories that challenge our perceptions and expand our understanding of the human experience. Stories that aren't afraid to confront uncomfortable truths and explore the complexity of being human in a world that often prefers simple categories and easy judgments. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story, because each one is crafted to make you think differently, to see the world from perspectives you might never have considered, to understand that everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about and carrying stories that could transform your understanding of what it means to be human. Thank you for listening to my story, for staying with me through this long and sometimes painful journey of self-discovery and transformation. Thank you for being willing to examine these difficult questions about prejudice and judgment and worth. And thank you, Roberto, wherever you are, for being brave enough to walk into that bank that day and show us all what we had become, for giving me the chance to become someone better, for proving that dignity and worth exist independent of circumstances, and that the measure of a person has nothing to do with their appearance and everything to do with their character, resilience, and humanity.